Okay, so in this video what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how you're going to start implementing the correct wrist move to start hitting the driver much straighter. Let's get stuck into it. The person of interest for this video would be Mo Norman. Now, we're not necessarily going to get into the details of exactly what Mo Norman was doing, but we're taking a little pinch of inspiration from Mo Norman. Now, for those of you who don't know, Mo Norman was a Canadian golf pro, won multiple times on tour, but will always go down in history. One, because he was a very interesting character, and two, because when he did these live demonstrations, he just delivered tremendous amounts of accuracy and barely ever seemed to miss, particularly a fairway. One of the main reasons for this is because, or should we say the main reason for this, is because he just produced a golf swing with very few moving parts, and most characteristically he talked about the setup position. Now, what happens when we hit a golf ball, okay, is that the club shaft will always be delivered slightly more vertically than the setup position, and the reason for this is because of the forces that are applied to the club. But what Mo Norman used to cite was the idea of starting in a position where you would kind of start with the club shaft sitting slightly higher as opposed to getting it sitting lower down. Now, the reason for today's video is not so much because I'm going to encourage you guys to start with the idea of you have to introduce this type of wrist position at the beginning. It's not that. But what we are doing is we're going to talk about the minimal amount of wrist movement that you want to have in the backswing position, because that's the reason why you can't hit driver. The thing with driver ultimately is obviously it's longer, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, but also it has less loft, and it's the less loft that plays the most amount of havoc for amateur golfers. And the reason for that is because most amateur golfers aren't very disciplined with their arms in the backswing, and they end up with very narrowing arms, excessive wrist motions, and quite an open club face, to the point where you're going to really struggle to get the face square at the point of impact. And what I always try and get my students to do in a very simple form is to try and get the feeling that you're going to keep your arms very wide, so very straight, quite connected to your body, or very connected to your body. And also I want you to feel like your trail palm is just pointing down towards the ground. Okay, and then what that's doing is that's reducing any excessive arm rotation and excessive arm movement in the backswing. And that's kind of what Mo Norman was doing. Mo Norman was somebody who would start with the club shaft slightly more vertical, and then as he kind of would swing back, he would talk about keeping the club very low to the ground. So again, that type of terminology would mean not picking it up and trying to, do all sorts of funky things with the wrist. And then he would kind of just talk about low to the ground and stretching that club back. And those were a few of the things that he would often sort of cite. And that's exactly the types of feelings that you want to have when it comes to driver. And this again is the kind of thing that I do with my students, and the results can be surprisingly amazing for these people, because if you do this motion and you play around with it, your feedback will be two things. The first one is your club face will feel very closed, because if you kind of just feel like you're stretching those arms back and you keep your right hand on top of your left, you'll feel like the club face very closed. In reality, as you can see here, I'm still perfectly on plane. I'm just avoiding any unnecessary wrist move. And the second thing is, if you concentrate on trying to keep your body more still and stretch your arms, it will feel shorter. And I promise you, if you start practicing by wider stance, okay, nice wide stance. I'm not saying you have to do this in the wrist position, but you can play around with it if you want to. But what I am saying is you want to feel like you're stretching those arms, keeping the palm to the ground, and then swing through. And I promise you, you're going to start splitting more fairways.